I'm in Matthew 5, 6, and 7, and we're doing a series of hopefully short videos and sessions on the Sermon on the Mount. This is Jesus speaking to his disciples, not to the crowds generally, but he's speaking to his disciples through 3 chapters um, of the book of Matthew 5, 6, and 7. So presumably this is fairly important if it's Jesus talking and he's talking that long. Um, this is his lesson on how to um, internalize God's principles and grow into our faith. Um, and he's going to be contrasting two systems: our sin nature, which is the flesh, with what he calls the kingdom of God, which is our spiritual nature. And these are actually two different operating systems. And he's going to make the point later on that you can't live out your life with one foot in each camp. You've got to choose and live and function within which operating system you choose. If you don't make a choice, the default position is you remain stuck in your flesh and trying to live out your life and solve all your problems and so forth and face the circumstances of life um, in your own strength. And that's kind of self-defeating, but that'll hopefully flesh itself out as we move on. This is a second session. In the first little video I did on this, we talked about Jesus leading off with what are known as the Beatitudes. And these are understood to be character traits, which they are, but in a more primitive and practical level, rather than just looking at this and saying, this is the character I have to become. What they are is on a pragmatic level is choices. When the circumstances of life come at us, rather than react, we need to step back, assess what's happening, choose an attitude, and then take action from that attitude. And that's why Jesus, when he says somebody hits you on the right side of the head, turn the other side of your head and let them hit you again. What he's really saying is don't react. If you react out of your flesh, you give up to control of your life to whatever triggers you. And at a much deeper level, you're never going to be able to step back and change the dynamics of whatever situation you're involved in or whatever circumstances are confronting you. So I believe Jesus' main point throughout these 3 chapters is to say, if you want to grow a godly character, we need to not react out of our flesh to the circumstances of our life, but step back, choose our attitude towards those circumstances, and then take action from that attitude and trust that God's going to show up. And a lot of times what he does is show up by giving us insight when we take that breath and choose that attitude and understand there's something other going on here than somebody just slapping me on the side of the head because they're angry. It might not be anything I did. It might be something going on inside of them. And so we're not going to get to that point if we constantly react in kind. And I think that's a big part of what Jesus is getting at. So I had talked a little bit about 2 of these attitudes, one being meekness, which is self-control, to step back, restrain yourself, and assess what's going on. The other was pursuing righteousness. Jesus said, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. And rather than, put a huge deeply theological interpretation on this, and getting into all kinds of church doctrine. I'm trying to look at this just from a common sense standpoint, and with the sense that in this context, I believe righteousness is simply deciding what is the single most right and principled thing to do in any situation, and then pursue that. Because when something comes at us, we always have our own agenda. We want this to go this way for this reason because this is what we want. And that's where a lot of competition comes in and a lot of conflict. Rather than do that, step back, put down your agenda, and just ask yourself, what's the right thing to do? Not the thing I want, or you know, what I think my agenda will be advanced if we do it a certain way. But what's the most principled thing to do here? And then decide to pursue that. So that was my take briefly on meekness or self-control, and righteousness, meaning determine what's the most principled thing to do here aside from anybody's agenda, and then pursue it. I want to talk about two more of these attitudes. And the nice thing is, when the circumstances of life come at us, rather than being triggered, uh, um, we can step back and choose our attitude, and Jesus gives us a list. I think there's 8 of them, so we can look at most of what's happening, and if we just take that first breath and step back and say, okay, what's the proper attitude towards this and what's going on here, then everything changes. Okay, I want to talk about, first of all, today, just 2 of them. First of all, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. So, what does poor in spirit look like? Just from a common sense understanding. And the way I would look at this is, if I'm looking at somebody that's caught up in let's say, a sinful lifestyle, and I know that their sin has them completely entangled. They're trying to justify it or rationalize it according to all these cultural narratives we put out now. But my flesh reaction to this as a Christian is to look at this and say, well, you're a sinner and you need to stop sinning. Okay. And stepping back and thinking about that, that's probably why us Christians have people throwing rocks at us a lot. I don't think it's enough to step back and say, you're living with your girlfriend and you're not married and you need to stop it. Okay. It's more helpful to understand first where we stand and where we have stood, and to understand that your friend may be living with his girlfriend, and that might be sin according to the Bible. And you may not be living with your girlfriend, but you've got a lot of stuff in your life too that isn't perfect. And we need to come to terms with who we are and who we were, to develop a proper attitude to how we deal with our friend who's caught in a lifestyle that is destructive. And I think in my life, the way this plays out practically, when Jesus is saying, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven, I think the attitude that I need to adopt and recognize before I speak judgment into somebody's life is to recognize that in my flesh, that's exactly where I am. And I think a good example of this is the story of David in the Old Testament, where he started counting the troops and evaluating what a great empire he had built. And his chief of staff at the time, I think it was Joab, said, and Jesus said, I want you to go out and take a census. I want to know exactly how many people I'm ruling over and how many troops I have and all this. And Joab, his chief of staff, said, David, I don't think this is a good idea. And the reason was there was pride at the heart of that. And Jesus went ahead and did it, realized he did wrong, and God stepped in and said, this is not a good idea, David, and I'm going to punish you for it. And he did. And there was a famine, there was a plague that came and took out some people and so forth. But the issue here was David didn't build this empire and unite Israel and expand their borders and all of this. God did. He was working through David, and David lost sight of that. And I think when we stand on a little throne as Christians and look at our friends and neighbors who are caught up in a sinful lifestyle, it's too easy for us to speak from the throne of where we think we are and say, you need to stop this, okay? Rather, we need to remember it's Christ's work in us that has given us everything we have and are. And the only way he can work through us is when we get off the throne and crawl back up on the altar and recognize just who we are without Christ. And then we can look to our friend or a neighbor or whoever, and through a relationship with them, not just preaching an edict or a rule, but we can find out where they're hurting and then speak truth into that hurt and speak truth into their lives, recognizing that we're no better than they are. But there's a way out, and to present it in that context. And I think it helps enormously to first remind ourselves who we are. And I've got kind of a fail-safe in my character now or what have you. And I'm not bragging about this, but this is kind of how it works. There are times when I'm doing something and it seems to be going well. And in my mind, I'm taking a little credit for it. What I'm actually doing is choosing to get off the altar, leave the spiritual operating system, step back on the throne, and start taking credit for things that I have no business taking credit to. The good news for me is my past life before Christ was so bankrupt that I can't bear to go back and dwell on that. And when I start turning away from the altar and crawling back up on the throne, what happens is something stops me, because there's this shadow of my old life following me. And when I focus on myself, all that old life comes back to haunt me and remind me of what I was apart from Christ. And I think to a very large degree, that's what Jesus is getting at here. Blessed are the poor in spirit, those who recognize that apart from God's work in us, we're exactly the people we're trying to help. And we're not going to be able to help them by lecturing them or hitting them over the head with a rule and say, you need to stop this because you're sinning. it has to go deeper than that, and it has to start with a remembrance and a reminder of where we stand without Christ, and having that sensitivity then, rather than presenting somebody with a rule and says you need to stop this because it's wrong, try and understand where we were and now where they are, and then speak truth into that and invite them to embrace that truth. Does that make sense? Second one I want to talk about is blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. And you can argue with my interpretation of all of this, because that's what I'm really giving you, is just my common sense understanding of these attitudes, and a lot of it grounded in my own experience. Blessed are those who mourn, they will be comforted. That to me is empathy. And in my world, empathy is grounded in, I've been there. I know where it hurts. I know how it hurts. Because of things that have broken me in the past. And I can't fix your hurt, but I can sit with you. I can hear you out. I can hug you because I've been there. And to remind ourselves that when somebody is hurting, there's a reason for it. And you can't always just heal somebody's hurt by patting them on the head and saying, okay, be warm and fed. It helps to remember where we hurt, where we've been broken, and to remind ourselves of that, so that we can truly come alongside of people that are hurting in a relationship, not from a point of being in a different place, but from a point of being in the same place, if that makes any sense at all. A lot of this gets back to who's on the throne. If I think my life is in order, and I just come to somebody who's hurting and say, okay, you'll get through this because I did. I'm not sure that's the right way to go about this. I think the right way is to step back when somebody's hurting and remember when you've been hurt, how you've been hurt, and ground yourself in that, so that from a relationship standpoint, you can just come and sit with them and say, I know how you feel. I can't fix it, but I can sit with you. So I think that's what we're looking at here. It's the attitude that we adopt toward things, not because we've been healed from all this and we're now on a higher plane and we can lecture people, but because we've been through a lot of this stuff and recognize that we're not on a higher plane without Christ, we're still exactly where they are. And the way out is to be able to understand where they're at, listen to where they're at, hear where they're at, and then very gently, from a relationship standpoint, bring truth into that and walk with them. So this is a short message, but those are the two that I wanted to tackle today. And this will get fleshed out once we get beyond the Beatitudes and get into Jesus speaking on how this stuff plays out. But I just wanted to present these two attitudes as food for thought. blessed are the poor in spirit, and blessed are those who mourn. Poor in spirit in my world is reminding myself what I was and what I still am every time I turn away from Christ, and trying to draw people into that healing. And mourning is really a reminder that I'm not here because I've defeated all the things that are hurting the person I want to help, but because I've been there. I do know how it feels. And I know that it's only our relationship with God that can bring healing to that. And it's not a matter of laying out a list of rules and saying, we'll do this different, that different, or this different. It's a matter of saying, I know where you stand. I've been there, and I'll walk with you. So thanks. Thanks for watching.